My name is Mara Whitfield. 30 minutes before I was supposed to receive the biggest honor of my career, my mother called and told me not to come. She didn't ask if I was nervous. She didn't congratulate me. She didn't even pretend she felt bad about what she was about to say. Her voice was calm, controlled, and frighteningly cold. Mara, don't embarrass this family tonight. Stay home. I stood frozen inside the women's restroom at Charleston Civic Hall, staring at my reflection in the mirror. I had spent 6 months saving for the navy blue dress I was wearing because tonight was supposed to be the night my grandmother would have been proud of me. Outside the door, I could hear the orchestra warming up, waiters carrying champagne, donors greeting one another, and hundreds of guests gathering for the Harbor Grace Foundation Gala. In less than half an hour, I was supposed to walk across that stage and receive the Clara Bell Humanitarian Award, an award recognizing years of work helping uninsured patients rebuild their lives after leaving the emergency room. Instead, my own mother was telling me not to show up. I tightened my grip around my phone. "What are you talking about?" I asked quietly. She sighed as though I had become another burden she needed to manage. "Things have changed. It would be better if you stayed away. People don't need unnecessary drama tonight." Drama. That word had followed me my entire life whenever I refused to sacrifice something for my family. Whenever Grant made another disastrous decision, I was expected to clean up the mess. Whenever Richard wanted something, I was expected to agree without asking questions. Whenever my mother decided appearances mattered more than honesty, I was expected to smile and play my role. Tonight was no different. I was 35 years old, but for as long as I could remember, I had been the invisible daughter. My older brother Grant was the pride of the Whitfield family. Charming, handsome, charismatic, and completely incapable of accepting responsibility for anything. Every failure became someone else's fault. Every bad investment was simply bad timing. Every lie became a misunderstanding. Yet my mother always defended him. Richard, my stepfather, admired him. Their friends praised him. Meanwhile, I earned scholarships, worked double shifts through nursing school, slept in my car between hospital rotations, built a nonprofit from nothing, and somehow I was still the disappointment. My grandmother Lillian was the only person who ever looked at me and saw potential instead of obligation. She taught me that kindness without boundaries eventually becomes permission for people to use you. I understood those words intellectually when I was 20. I finally understood them emotionally at 35. My nonprofit, Homeward Hands, had started because I was tired of watching patients leave the emergency room with nowhere safe to recover. They weren't sick enough to stay admitted, but they weren't well enough to go home either. Some slept in their cars. Some returned to abusive households. Some simply came back 2 days later in worse condition. I refused to believe that was acceptable. So I started helping one patient at a time. Then 10. Then 100. Volunteers joined. Doctors donated supplies. Churches opened temporary housing. What began with the trunk of my old Honda eventually became the largest independent patient recovery program in Charleston. Tonight, the foundation planned to honor that work. Or at least they had planned to. "Mom," I asked slowly, "what exactly changed?" She hesitated just long enough for me to know I wasn't going to like the answer. "Grant is making an announcement tonight." My stomach tightened. What announcement? The Harbor Grace Board selected him as the new executive director. I laughed once because it was too absurd to process. No, they offered me that position last week. They reconsidered. 4 words. 4 words that erased 3 years of work. I leaned against the sink, suddenly feeling the room tilt beneath me. Why? Another pause. Then came the real reason. Richard told them you still refuse to transfer your grandmother's property. Everything suddenly made sense. 3 weeks earlier, my family invited me to Sunday dinner. They almost never invited me anywhere unless they wanted something. After dessert, Richard quietly placed a folder in front of me. Inside was a deed transfer agreement. They wanted me to sign my grandmother's riverfront house over to Grant so he could use it as collateral for another failing business venture. They called it temporary. I called it theft. I refused. My grandmother had left that property to me with one handwritten sentence inside her will. Mara will know what this house is meant to become. I knew exactly what she meant. I planned to convert it into a recovery center for vulnerable patients leaving the hospital with nowhere else to go. It was the heart of everything I had built. Grant wanted to mortgage it. Richard wanted to control it. My mother wanted me to surrender it because family comes first. When I refused, they quietly began destroying everything I had spent years creating. Now they had taken my promotion too. "Mom," I whispered, "you convinced the board not to hire me." Silence. Then she answered with absolute confidence. "Leadership requires someone donors can trust." I closed my eyes. I built the program. Grant has presence. Those 4 words hurt more than I expected. Grant had presence. I had sacrifice. Grant had charm. I had results. Grant inherited opportunities. I created them. Yet somehow he deserved the reward. "Here's what's going to happen," my mother continued. "You'll quietly leave through the side entrance. Tomorrow you'll sign the transfer papers. Harbor Grace will absorb homeward hands. Grant will oversee the transition, and everyone wins." I almost smiled. Not because it was funny, because after 35 years, I finally saw the truth with complete clarity. They had never loved what I created. They only wanted control over it. "No," I said calmly. She went silent. "Excuse me?" I said no. "Don't be difficult. I'm done being useful." Her breathing became heavier. "If you walk into that ballroom tonight, you'll regret it." I looked toward the double doors leading into the gala. The orchestra had finished warming up. Guests were taking their seats. Cameras were ready. Reporters waited near the stage. They believed tonight belonged to Grant. They had no idea it was about to become something entirely different. I ended the call without another word. I opened the restroom door and stepped into the hallway. Every step toward the ballroom felt lighter than the one before it. I wasn't walking toward another family disappointment. I was walking toward the moment they would finally learn the cost of underestimating me. As I reached the ballroom entrance, the gala coordinator hurried toward me looking terrified. "Miss Whitfield, your seat has been removed from the head table." I smiled politely. "That's all right." She blinked in confusion. "You're not upset?" I looked past her toward the brightly lit ballroom where Grant was already shaking hands beneath crystal chandeliers as though he had earned every ounce of admiration surrounding him. "No," I answered quietly. "I'm exactly where I need to be." Then I walked inside, unaware that less than 10 minutes later, 2 state investigators would open those ballroom doors, carrying a warrant with Grant Whitfield's name printed across the top. The ballroom erupted into whispers the moment the 2 state investigators stepped through the grand entrance. Their dark suits stood out against the glittering sea of tuxedos and designer gowns, and the conversations that had filled the room only seconds earlier dissolved into uneasy silence. Grant's confident smile faltered for the first time that evening. He tried to laugh it off, adjusting the microphone in his hand as though nothing unusual was happening, but I could see the color slowly draining from his face. My mother remained perfectly still at the head table, although the champagne glass she was holding trembled just enough for me to notice. Richard rose to his feet immediately, every inch of his posture radiating authority as he intercepted the investigators before they could reach the stage. "Gentlemen," he said with a practiced smile, "I'm afraid you've interrupted a private charitable event. Perhaps we can discuss whatever this is outside." The older investigator calmly removed a leather credential holder from his jacket and displayed his identification. "We're looking for Mr. Grant Whitfield." Every eye in the ballroom shifted toward my brother. Grant forced another smile and spread his arms confidently. "That would be me." "Is there some kind of misunderstanding? We simply need a few minutes of your time regarding financial documents connected to Harbor Grace Foundation." Grant laughed louder than necessary. "Financial documents? I haven't even started the job yet." The younger investigator glanced toward the stage projector before returning his attention to Grant. "Actually, Mr. Whitfield, that's one of several issues we'd like to clarify." I remained where I was, saying nothing. This wasn't the moment to speak. It was the moment to let everyone watch the mask begin to crack. The gala guests exchanged confused glances. Several board members quietly leaned toward one another, whispering behind folded programs. Across the room, I noticed at least 4 reporters lifting their phones to begin recording. Richard understood exactly what was happening. He knew public perception could collapse faster than facts. He climbed onto the stage beside Grant and gently took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced warmly, "I'm sure this is nothing more than routine paperwork. Please continue enjoying your evening while we sort out this administrative inconvenience." Nobody moved. Nobody reached for another glass of champagne. Nobody resumed their conversations. They were all watching the Whitfield family. They had spent decades believing we represented integrity, philanthropy, and leadership. Tonight, those assumptions were beginning to fracture. One of the Harbor Grace trustees slowly approached Richard. "Is everything all right?" he asked quietly. Richard smiled without hesitation. "Of course. We've always cooperated fully with every regulatory review." The investigator interrupted him. "This isn't a regulatory review." Another wave of whispers spread across the ballroom. Richard's smile stiffened. "Then perhaps you'd like to explain why you're here." The investigator reached into a slim black folder and removed several documents. "We've received evidence suggesting restricted charitable funds may have been redirected through multiple consulting contracts over the past 18 months. Someone near the back gasped. Another trustee frowned. "Redirected where?" The investigator didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked directly at Grant. "Perhaps Mr. Whitfield would like to explain the invoices submitted under Bell Strategic Solutions." Grant blinked twice. Too quickly, too nervously. I recognized that expression. It was the same face he made every time he had been caught lying as a child. My mother suddenly stood. "This is outrageous," she declared loudly enough for the room to hear. "My son has dedicated himself to helping this community." The investigator nodded politely. "We're not questioning charitable intentions, ma'am. We're questioning financial records." Richard stepped forward again, attempting to position himself between Grant and the investigators. "You have no authority to conduct this conversation publicly. Actually," the investigator replied, "Mr. Whitfield voluntarily entered a public event immediately after signing official employment documents this afternoon. We simply need answers before additional organizational authority changes hands." My brother swallowed hard. "I don't know anything about consulting contracts." The investigator opened the folder again. "Your signature appears on every one of them." Grant looked toward Richard. It was only for a fraction of a second, but I caught it. So did the investigator. Richard noticed too late. The older investigator quietly made a note on his pad. My mother hurried onto the stage, wrapping one protective arm around Grant as though he were still 10 years old. "He signs dozens of documents. He trusts professionals to handle details." "Professionals like Mr. Richard Whitfield?" the younger investigator asked. Richard's jaw tightened. "Be careful with your accusations." "We're being extremely careful." Silence settled across the ballroom. I looked around the room and realized something remarkable. No one was looking at Grant anymore. They were all watching Richard. For years, he had controlled every conversation with confidence. Tonight, that confidence was slipping away, one sentence at a time. The chairman of Harbor Grace slowly stood from his table. "Richard," he said cautiously, "is there something the board should know?" Richard turned toward him with controlled irritation. "Absolutely not." Before he could continue, one of the investigators lifted another document. "Then perhaps you can explain why these payments were approved using your executive authorization code 6 months after your retirement." The chairman's expression changed instantly. Several trustees stood simultaneously. Reporters pushed closer to the stage. Camera flashes began exploding throughout the ballroom. Grant whispered something under his breath that nobody else seemed to hear. I heard it clearly. "Dad, you told me everything was legal." Richard slowly turned toward him. For the first time in my life, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Not anger, not arrogance. Fear. Because Grant had just said 2 words that should never have been spoken in front of witnesses, and every camera in the ballroom had captured them. Grant's words echoed through the ballroom far louder than he intended. "Dad, you told me everything was legal." The silence that followed was almost painful. Nobody reached for another drink. Nobody looked away. Every camera lens in the room turned toward Richard Whitfield, who had spent decades building a reputation as the calm, untouchable patriarch who always knew exactly what to say. This time, no words came. His jaw tightened, his eyes locked on Grant, and for just a heartbeat, the carefully crafted image he had protected for years cracked wide enough for everyone to see the panic beneath it. Grant immediately realized what he had done. "That's not what I meant," he stammered, forcing an awkward laugh. "I meant, Dad always tells me to make sure everything is legal before I sign anything." The explanation landed like a lead balloon. No one believed it. The older investigator calmly closed the folder in his hands and looked directly at Richard. "Would you mind explaining that statement, Mr. Whitfield?" Richard straightened his jacket and finally found his voice. "My son is overwhelmed. He's had a very emotional evening. I advise you not to interpret nervous comments as evidence." The investigator nodded politely. "We're not interpreting anything. We're documenting everything." Another burst of camera flashes lit the ballroom. Several members of the Harbor Grace Board quietly stepped away from Richard as if distance alone could protect them from whatever was unfolding. I remained near the front of the stage, saying nothing. Years earlier, I would have stepped in to save Grant from embarrassing himself. I would have softened the tension, redirected the conversation, or taken responsibility for someone else's mistakes simply because that was the role my family had trained me to play. Not tonight. Tonight they would experience consequences without me cushioning the fall. Vivian Cross, the gala chairwoman, approached the investigators with visible anxiety. "Excuse me, are we talking about an accounting error?" she asked hopefully. The younger investigator answered before anyone else could. "We're talking about several $1 million that appear to have moved through organizations connected to Harbor Grace under consulting agreements that may never have existed." A collective gasp rolled across the ballroom. One trustee shook his head in disbelief. "Several million?" Another immediately pulled out his phone and began searching through recent board reports. Richard noticed the shifting mood and understood he was losing control. "This is exactly why these matters should never be discussed publicly," he declared. "False accusations destroy reputations." "False accusations do," the investigator agreed. "Evidence doesn't." He opened the folder again and removed another document. "Would you recognize this invoice?" Richard glanced down only briefly before forcing himself to look away. That fraction of a second was enough, the investigator noticed. "So did I." "I've signed thousands of documents during my career," Richard answered. "I couldn't possibly identify one piece of paper from memory." "Interesting," the investigator replied. "Because you looked at the signature before claiming you couldn't identify it." Richard said nothing. My mother finally stepped forward, determined to rescue the situation the only way she knew how. "This family has donated millions to Charleston hospitals," she announced loudly. "We've funded scholarships, children's programs, disaster relief, and countless charitable events. Are you honestly trying to destroy decades of service over paperwork?" The older investigator looked at her with professional calm. "Charitable work doesn't exempt anyone from financial accountability." Her expression hardened instantly. She had spent her entire adult life believing influence could solve every problem. Tonight, influence wasn't working. I watched board members quietly gather near one corner of the ballroom. They weren't speaking to Richard anymore. They were speaking among themselves. Several were reviewing emails on their phones. Others were comparing dates and financial summaries. Seeds of doubt were spreading faster than anyone in my family realized. Grant noticed it too. His breathing became noticeably heavier. "Dad," he whispered again, barely loud enough for Richard to hear. "Tell them." Richard kept his eyes forward. "Stop talking. Tell them I didn't know." Richard's answer came through clenched teeth. "I said stop talking." Grant's shoulders stiffened. I recognized that look. It wasn't guilt. It was betrayal. For the first time in his life, the man who had always protected him wasn't stepping in front of the bullet. He was stepping away from it. The chairman of Harbor Grace slowly approached the stage holding a folder of his own. "Richard," he said quietly, "there's something I need you to explain." Richard looked annoyed rather than concerned. Not now. Actually, now. The chairman opened the folder. 6 months ago, you personally recommended that Homeward Hands be absorbed into Harbor Grace because, according to your presentation, the foundation lacked a sustainable patient recovery program. He looked toward me before continuing. At the time, you specifically instructed the board not to offer Mara an executive position because you claimed she wasn't interested in organizational leadership. My mother froze. Grant slowly turned toward Richard. I felt every eye in the ballroom shift toward me. The chairman continued. Yesterday we discovered Mara never declined the position. The room became perfectly still. She was never informed the board had approved her unanimously. Several trustees looked at one another in complete shock. One elderly woman raised her hand to her mouth. What? She whispered. The chairman swallowed hard. Someone intercepted the notification before it was delivered. Every camera in the ballroom turned toward Richard Whitfield once again. Then the chairman slowly lifted another envelope. And according to our internal server logs, he paused as his voice became noticeably tighter. The email deleting Mara's appointment letter was sent from Richard Whitfield's personal administrative account. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The chairman's final sentence seemed to hang beneath the crystal chandeliers, refusing to disappear. Every pair of eyes in the ballroom settled on Richard Whitfield. The confident hospital executive who had spent decades controlling board meetings, fundraising dinners, and political conversations suddenly looked like a man searching for an exit that no longer existed. My mother slowly turned toward him, confusion replacing certainty for the first time that night. Richard, she whispered, tell them that's impossible. Richard didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the envelope in the chairman's hand. I'd like to examine whatever documents you're referring to. The chairman stepped backward before Richard could touch it. No. The single word surprised everyone. Richard blinked. Excuse me? These records have already been copied and delivered to legal counsel. Another murmur swept through the ballroom. Board members who had spent years following Richard's recommendations without question now looked at him with unmistakable suspicion. One trustee adjusted his glasses and quietly asked, Are you saying someone intentionally prevented the board's decision from reaching Mara? The chairman nodded slowly. That's exactly what our preliminary review indicates. Grant stared at Richard as though seeing him for the first time. You told me they changed their minds. Richard finally found his voice. They would have. Grant frowned. What? Once they understood the bigger picture, Grant's confusion deepened. You told me the board wanted me. Richard's expression hardened. Because they needed you. I watched the realization slowly spread across my brother's face. For years, he believed he had earned every promotion, every invitation, every opportunity placed in front of him. Tonight, he was beginning to understand that many of those victories had been manufactured. My mother looked from Richard to Grant and back again. Richard, what did you do? He answered without hesitation. I protected this family. By lying? She asked quietly. By making necessary decisions. You forged the board's decision? Richard shook his head impatiently. Don't be dramatic, Evelyn. The investigator stepped forward. Then perhaps you can explain why your administrative credentials accessed the Foundation's secure server at 11:43 p.m. On the evening the board voted. Richard folded his arms. Someone stole my credentials. Interesting. The investigator removed another document. Because building security footage shows you entering the executive offices at exactly 11:39 p.m. and leaving 12 minutes later. Richard remained silent. Would you like us to play the footage? The investigator asked calmly. Camera flashes exploded across the ballroom. Several reporters rushed toward the front, sensing the story becoming larger with every passing minute. I noticed Harbor Grace donors quietly slipping away from the Whitfield table, creating an empty circle around my mother and Richard. No one wanted to be seen standing beside them anymore. My mother looked devastated. Richard, she repeated, tell me this isn't true. He turned toward her with visible irritation. This is exactly why I never wanted any of this discussed publicly. People don't understand leadership. Leadership? One trustee interrupted sharply. You overruled a unanimous board decision. Richard lifted his chin. I corrected a mistake. The trustee stared at him in disbelief. Mara created the most successful outreach program this foundation has ever partnered with. Richard answered without emotion. She lacked executive presence. I almost smiled. There it was again. Presence. The same excuse my mother had used on the phone less than an hour earlier. The same lie repeated so often they had started believing it themselves. One elderly donor slowly stood from her table. She had contributed millions to Harbor Grace over the past 2 decades and rarely spoke during board events. When she did, everyone listened. She looked directly at Richard. Tell me something. Richard nodded respectfully. Of course. Did you ever intend to let Mara become executive director? Richard didn't answer immediately. That hesitation was enough. The woman sighed. I thought so. She reached into her purse, removed a folded pledge agreement worth $5 million, and quietly tore it in half. The ripping sound echoed through the silent ballroom like thunder. Gasps filled the room. Mrs. Harrison, Vivian whispered. The elderly woman calmly placed the torn papers on the nearest table. Harbor Grace was built to help patients, not protect family dynasties. She looked toward me. Miss Whitfield. Our eyes met across the ballroom. I'm sorry we didn't see this sooner. Before I could answer, another donor stood. Then another. Within moments, several prominent supporters walked away from Richard's table, gathering near the opposite side of the ballroom. Decades of influence were dissolving in real time. Grant watched the scene unfold with growing panic. Dad, he whispered. They're leaving. Richard's jaw tightened. Let them. They're taking the donors. We'll replace them. Grant stared at him. With who? Richard didn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, he didn't have one. Just then, the younger investigator's phone vibrated. He glanced down at the screen, read the message, and looked directly at his partner. The older investigator gave a slight nod. Then he turned toward Richard. Mr. Whitfield. His voice remained calm, but the atmosphere inside the ballroom changed instantly. We just received authorization to expand our investigation. Richard's expression remained unreadable. Into what? The investigator slowly reached back into his folder and removed a second sealed warrant. Not just Harbor Grace Foundation. He looked directly into Richard's eyes before finishing the sentence. We're now investigating Whitfield Medical Holdings. My mother's face turned completely white. Because Whitfield Medical Holdings wasn't just another company. It was the corporation that owned nearly everything Richard had spent 30 years building. Richard Whitfield didn't move. His face remained expressionless, but I had known him long enough to recognize the tiny muscle twitching near his jaw. It only appeared when he realized he was no longer in control. The second warrant rested in the investigator's hand like a loaded weapon. Nobody in the ballroom dared breathe too loudly. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a moment, sensing that whatever happened next would become tomorrow's headline across South Carolina. Whitfield Medical Holdings? One of the trustees repeated under his breath. What does Harbor Grace have to do with Whitfield Medical Holdings? The investigator answered without taking his eyes off Richard. That's exactly what we're here to determine. Richard finally smiled. It wasn't warm. It wasn't confident. It was the smile of a man desperately buying time. My company operates 17 outpatient clinics and employs over 800 people. Are you seriously suggesting a respected healthcare organization is under criminal investigation because of an accounting misunderstanding? No, the investigator replied evenly. We're suggesting that charitable assets may have been redirected into privately controlled entities connected to Whitfield Medical Holdings. A wave of disbelief swept across the room. Several board members instinctively opened their phones, searching for public records. Others began whispering names of clinics, subsidiaries, and investment groups connected to Richard's healthcare empire. The chairman slowly lowered himself into a chair as though his legs had suddenly become too weak to support him. Richard, he whispered, please tell me they have this wrong. Richard ignored him completely. Instead, he looked directly at me for the first time since the investigators arrived. There was no anger in his eyes anymore, only calculation. He knew exactly who had started this chain of events. He simply hadn't expected me to survive long enough to fight back. "Mara," he said calmly, his voice carrying across the silent ballroom, "is this what you wanted?" Hundreds of heads turned toward me again. I remained perfectly still. "What I wanted," I answered, "was to build a recovery center for patients who had nowhere else to go." I paused before continuing. "You wanted my property." Richard's expression never changed. "Your grandmother's house was an underused asset. It was her legacy. Sentiment doesn't build institutions. Neither does theft." Another burst of camera flashes exploded throughout the ballroom. Richard exhaled slowly. "You always mistake difficult decisions for cruelty." "No," I replied. "I mistake cruelty for cruelty." My mother stepped between us before Richard could respond. Tears had begun forming in her eyes, though I couldn't tell whether they came from heartbreak or fear. "Mara," she pleaded softly, "please, not here." I looked at her for several seconds. Once upon a time, those words would have stopped me instantly. They would have reminded me that family disagreements belonged behind closed doors. But behind closed doors was where they had stolen promotions, manipulated board members, spread lies about my character, and tried to take the last gift my grandmother ever left me. Behind closed doors had always protected them, never me. "Where exactly would you prefer we have this conversation?" I asked quietly. "In your dining room? Like the day you asked me to sign away Grandma's house? Or perhaps in Richard's office where he deleted my appointment letter?" My mother's lips trembled. She had no answer. The older investigator cleared his throat. "Mr. Whitfield, we'd like access to your financial servers before any records can be altered." Richard folded his arms. "You'll need a court order." The investigator held up the second warrant. "That's what this is." Richard's eyes narrowed. "You moved quickly." "Actually," the investigator replied, "this process began nearly 4 months ago." Richard froze. 4 months. I watched him mentally retrace every meeting, every phone call, every document he had approved during that time. Someone had been watching. Someone had been building a case long before tonight. Grant looked completely lost. 4 months?" he asked. "Dad, why would they investigate us 4 months ago?" Richard didn't answer. Grant looked toward me instead. "Mara, did you know about this?" I met his eyes. "No, that part was true." I hadn't known how extensive the investigation had become. I only knew that after discovering my appointment letter had mysteriously disappeared, I hired an independent cybersecurity firm to audit Homeward Hands' communication records. They uncovered unauthorized access attempts, deleted correspondence, and financial requests bearing forged digital approvals connected to Harbor Grace. Everything after that had grown far beyond me. Federal agencies, state investigators, forensic accountants. Once the evidence started connecting, the machine had moved on its own. The younger investigator opened another folder. "Mr. Whitfield, before we execute this warrant, there's one more issue we'd like clarified." Richard remained silent. Over the last 18 months, Whitfield Medical Holdings acquired 6 urgent care facilities that had previously received Harbor Grace redevelopment grants. Richard finally answered. "That's public information." "It is. The acquisitions were legal." "Perhaps." The investigator slowly removed a color-coded financial chart and placed it on the nearest table where everyone could see it. "What isn't public is how those properties were appraised before purchase." Several trustees leaned closer. Even from where I stood, I could see rows of highlighted numbers connected by arrows. The investigator continued. "Each property was declared financially distressed immediately before acquisition." He pointed to another column. "Then, less than 90 days later, each one was revalued at more than 3 times its purchase price." Silence. One donor frowned. "How is that possible?" The investigator answered without hesitation. "It generally isn't." Richard spoke before anyone else could. "Healthcare markets fluctuate, not by 300% in a single quarter." The room became even quieter. Then something unexpected happened. One of Whitfield Medical Holdings' own vice presidents slowly stood from a table near the back. I recognized him immediately. Daniel Reeves. He had worked beside Richard for almost 15 years and was considered one of his most loyal executives. Daniel looked pale. His hands shook slightly as he adjusted his tie. "I'd like to say something," he announced. Richard's head snapped toward him. "Sit down, Daniel." Daniel didn't move. Instead, he looked directly at the investigators. "If I'm granted legal immunity." Every muscle in Richard's body tensed. Daniel swallowed hard before finishing his sentence. "I have copies of every internal valuation report that was changed before those acquisitions closed." The ballroom erupted. Reporters rushed forward. Board members stood simultaneously. Grant stared at Daniel in complete disbelief. My mother grabbed Richard's arm, but he barely seemed to notice, because the man he trusted more than anyone else had just decided to save himself. And judging by the look on Daniel Reeves' face, he wasn't even close to revealing everything. The ballroom dissolved into absolute chaos the moment Daniel Reeves finished speaking. Reporters surged toward him from every direction, microphones stretching over one another, while camera flashes exploded so rapidly the room seemed trapped inside a lightning storm. Richard Whitfield didn't shout. He didn't lunge. He simply stared at Daniel with the cold, controlled expression of a man watching decades of loyalty evaporate in front of his eyes. "Think very carefully about what you're doing," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. The threat wasn't hidden. It wasn't emotional. It was precise. Daniel had heard that tone before. Everyone who had worked under Richard had. It was the voice that ended careers without raising volume. Daniel inhaled deeply but didn't back away. "I have thought about it," he answered. "For almost 2 years." Every conversation stopped again. Even the investigators exchanged a quick glance. Richard's eyes narrowed. "Then you've made a terrible mistake." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No, my mistake was staying quiet." Those words landed harder than anyone expected. The younger investigator stepped beside Daniel. "Mr. Reeves, are you prepared to make a formal statement?" Daniel nodded. "Yes." Richard immediately interrupted. "He's lying to protect himself." Daniel laughed softly, though there wasn't a trace of humor in it. "I probably am protecting myself. The difference is," he looked directly at Richard, "I'm finally telling the truth while doing it." My mother clutched the edge of the nearest table as though she might collapse. "Daniel, you've been with this family for 15 years. That's exactly why I know what happened." Grant looked from Daniel to Richard in complete confusion. "What is he talking about?" Nobody answered him. Daniel reached inside his suit jacket and removed a small black flash drive. He held it between 2 fingers before handing it directly to the older investigator. "Everything is here," he said quietly. "Original property valuations, internal emails, executive meeting recordings, backup accounting ledgers." The investigator accepted the device carefully. "Have these files been altered?" "No." "How do you know?" Daniel looked at me for only a brief moment before answering. "Because 6 months ago I made 3 encrypted copies. One is in your hand. One was delivered to my attorney yesterday morning. The third," he paused, "was automatically uploaded to a secure cloud server 2 hours before tonight's gala began." Richard's face finally changed. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something colder. The realization that even if he stopped Daniel now, the evidence would still survive. He took one slow step forward. "You've destroyed your career," Daniel smiled sadly. "You destroyed it the day you asked me to change those valuation reports." A loud gasp rippled through the ballroom. One of Whitfield Medical Holdings' regional directors slowly lowered himself into a chair, visibly shaken. Another executive quietly removed his company lapel pin and slipped it into his pocket, hoping nobody would notice. The investigators certainly noticed. "Mr. Reeves?" the younger investigator asked. "Did anyone else participate in altering financial records?" Daniel hesitated. Richard immediately spoke over him. "Don't answer that." Daniel ignored him completely. "Yes." The ballroom became so quiet that I could hear the air conditioning humming overhead. "Who?" the investigator asked. Daniel looked down for several seconds before raising his eyes again. Not everyone knew what they were signing. He swallowed. But everyone followed Richard's instructions. Richard laughed once. It was hollow. Convenient. Daniel continued as though Richard hadn't spoken. He never sent illegal requests directly. He separated every transaction into small pieces, different departments, different managers, different approval chains. Nobody except Richard could see the entire picture. Several Harbor Grace trustees exchanged horrified looks. One whispered, "That's why nothing looked suspicious during audits." The investigator nodded slowly. Classic compartmentalization. Richard folded his arms. "You're building a conspiracy out of ordinary corporate management." Before anyone could respond, another voice interrupted from the back of the ballroom. "He's telling the truth." Every head turned. An elderly man wearing a maintenance uniform stood near the service entrance. Most guests hadn't noticed him all evening. He had spent hours quietly adjusting lighting equipment before the gala began. I recognized him immediately. Samuel Ortiz. He had worked maintenance at Whitfield Medical Holdings headquarters for nearly 20 years. Richard's expression darkened. "What are you doing here?" Samuel stepped forward holding an old leather folder. "Finishing something I should have done a long time ago." My mother frowned. "Your maintenance." Samuel nodded. "I was." He looked toward the investigators. "Until I retired 3 months ago." The older investigator approached him. "Sir?" Samuel carefully opened the worn folder. Inside were dozens of handwritten maintenance logs. "Everyone ignores maintenance workers," he said quietly. "We're invisible. We fix lights, replace locks, clean offices after executives go home." He removed several photocopied access logs. "People also forget that electronic door systems record every entry." Richard's breathing slowed almost imperceptibly. Samuel continued. "Every night Richard claimed he was working late. He entered the executive accounting office after everyone else had gone home. He handed the logs to the investigator. The dates match every major financial adjustment Daniel described. The investigator quickly compared the logs with his documents. His expression became noticeably more serious. "They do match." Reporters practically ran toward Samuel, but he ignored every microphone pointed in his direction. Instead, he looked directly at me. "Your grandmother treated every employee with respect," he said softly. "When my wife got sick, she secretly paid for her medication for 6 months." My throat tightened. Samuel smiled sadly. "I've carried this folder ever since she passed away because I always hoped someone in your family would choose honesty." His eyes shifted toward Richard. "I finally realized that someone wasn't going to be him." My mother lowered her head. Grant stood perfectly still, unable to process what he was hearing. The investigators quietly placed Samuel's documents into an evidence bag beside Daniel's flash drive. Then the older investigator looked toward Richard once again. "Mr. Whitfield." His voice was calm, almost sympathetic. "This investigation is becoming considerably larger than financial misconduct." Richard didn't answer. "Based on the testimony we've received tonight." The investigator glanced toward his partner before finishing the sentence. "We now have probable cause to investigate possible witness intimidation and evidence tampering." For the first time that evening, Richard Whitfield looked toward the ballroom doors instead of the people accusing him. It was only a brief glance. Barely noticeable. But the investigators saw it immediately. So did I. He wasn't looking for an escape. He was checking whether someone else had already arrived. And whatever or whoever he expected to walk through those doors, I hadn't shown up yet. Richard's eyes remained fixed on the ballroom doors. It was such a small movement that most people never noticed it, but the investigators did. So did I. Whatever confidence he still possessed wasn't coming from the evidence, the lawyers, or the reputation he had spent 30 years building. It was coming from someone he believed was about to walk into that room and change everything. The older investigator quietly followed Richard's line of sight before speaking into a small radio clipped beneath his jacket. He didn't say much, just 4 words. "Secure every entrance now." Within seconds, 2 uniformed state officers appeared near the ballroom exits, while another positioned himself outside the main doors. Richard saw it happen. The faintest hint of disappointment crossed his face before disappearing behind another practiced smile. "You're being overly dramatic," he said. "No one is trying to leave. We're making sure no one enters," the investigator replied. Richard didn't respond. His silence spoke louder than any argument could have. The reporters sensed another turn in the story. Microphones shifted away from Daniel and Samuel, returning once again to Richard. Every camera remained pointed toward him. The man who had controlled every public appearance of his career was now trapped inside one he couldn't script. Grant stepped toward his stepfather, his voice barely steady. "Dad, who were you expecting?" Richard looked at him for a long moment before answering. "No one. You looked at the door. You're imagining things." Grant shook his head. "No. You're waiting for someone." My mother turned slowly toward Richard. She had spent years defending him without asking questions. Tonight, she was finally beginning to ask them. "Richard," she said quietly, "answer him." Richard's patience cracked for the first time. "Enough." The single word echoed sharply through the ballroom. My mother flinched. Grant took an involuntary step backward. Around the room, several guests exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was the first time many of them had seen Richard without the polished executive mask he wore in public. The younger investigator broke the silence. "Mr. Whitfield, we're going to need your phone." Richard looked directly at him. "No. The warrant authorizes seizure of all electronic devices connected to the investigation. My attorneys will contact you. They can certainly do that." The investigator extended his hand. "Your phone." Richard reached into his pocket slowly. For one hopeful second, it appeared he intended to cooperate. Instead, he held the phone tightly in his palm without handing it over. His thumb moved almost imperceptibly across the screen. "I saw it. So did Daniel." "Stop him!" Daniel shouted. The younger investigator reacted instantly, stepping forward just as Richard pressed something on the screen. The device vibrated once before the investigator pulled it from his hand. "Airplane mode," Richard said calmly. "Old habit." Daniel shook his head violently. "No." He looked directly at the investigators. He wasn't turning on airplane mode. The older investigator quickly examined the screen. His expression changed. He initiated a remote security protocol. The room went silent again. "Can you stop it?" Daniel asked urgently. The investigator didn't answer immediately. Instead, he handed the phone to a digital forensics specialist who had quietly entered the ballroom minutes earlier. The specialist connected the phone to a small encrypted device, typing rapidly across its screen. Everyone waited. 30 seconds felt like 30 minutes. Finally, the specialist looked up. "We interrupted it." Richard remained expressionless. "Interrupted what?" the investigator asked. The specialist took a slow breath. "A remote command designed to erase synchronized corporate servers." A collective gasp swept across the ballroom. Several executives instinctively reached for their own phones. One trustee whispered, "He tried to destroy everything." Richard finally spoke again. "You can't prove that." The specialist calmly rotated the small screen so everyone could see it. Across the display appeared a timestamp, Richard's user credentials, and a command labeled "Execute Full Archive Purge." There was no room for interpretation, no room for excuses. My mother covered her mouth with both hands. "Richard," she whispered, "what have you done?" Richard didn't even look at her. He was staring at the specialist, calculating, measuring, searching for another move. The older investigator carefully placed Richard's phone into an evidence bag. Attempting to destroy evidence after execution of a lawful warrant is a separate criminal offense. Richard gave a short laugh. "Only if you can prove intent." Before the investigator could answer, another voice came from the ballroom entrance. "I don't think intent is going to be your biggest problem anymore." Every head turned. A woman in her early 40s stepped through the open doors carrying 2 banker boxes filled with files. She wore a simple gray business suit, her expression calm despite hundreds of people suddenly staring at her. Daniel's eyes widened immediately. "Laura." Richard's confidence disappeared completely. My heart skipped a beat because I recognized her too. Laura Bennett had been Whitfield Medical Holdings' chief financial officer until 18 months earlier. According to Richard, she had resigned to spend more time with her family. Laura stopped several feet inside the ballroom and looked directly at the investigators. "I'm sorry I'm late," she said. "Traffic was worse than expected." She gently set the boxes on the nearest table. These are the original accounting ledgers Richard thought were destroyed during the archive migration. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. Laura placed one hand on the top file and looked directly at Richard. "You told everyone I resigned." She paused. "You forgot to mention you fired me because I refused to sign fraudulent financial statements." Richard slowly closed his eyes. Just for a second. It was the first visible sign that he finally understood the truth. This wasn't one witness. This wasn't one mistake. This wasn't one bad night. Someone had spent months putting every missing piece together. Laura opened the first box, removed a thick blue binder, and handed it to the lead investigator. "The accounting fraud didn't start 18 months ago," she said quietly. "It started 12 years ago." The investigator looked at the date printed across the first page. Then he slowly raised his eyes toward Richard. "Mr. Whitfield," he said, "I think this investigation just became the largest healthcare fraud case this office has ever seen." Laura Bennett's final sentence landed like an earthquake beneath the crystal chandeliers. "It started 12 years ago." No one spoke. Even the reporters who had been shouting questions only moments earlier lowered their microphones. 12 years. That wasn't a bookkeeping mistake. That wasn't a bad investment. That was an entire business model. The lead investigator slowly opened the blue binder Laura had handed him. Every page was covered with color-coded annotations, handwritten notes, banking references, acquisition records, and internal approval chains. He flipped only 3 pages before stopping. His expression hardened. "These are original signatures," he murmured. Laura nodded. Every document was scanned before Richard ordered them replaced with revised copies. Richard's eyes never left the binder. For the first time that evening, he looked genuinely uncertain. Not because Laura had appeared, but because she had brought the one thing he believed no longer existed: originals. "Where did you get those?" he asked quietly. Laura smiled without warmth. "You taught me something years ago." Richard remained silent. "Always keep copies of everything." Several reporters immediately wrote down the quote. One television producer whispered excitedly into her headset. Everyone understood they were witnessing the collapse of one of the most respected healthcare executives in the state. The younger investigator continued reviewing the binder before stopping at a page marked with a red tab. He looked toward Laura. "This account number appears repeatedly." Laura nodded again. "Follow the transfers." The investigator traced the highlighted lines across the page. Harbor Grace Foundation, Whitfield Medical Holdings, Bell Strategic Solutions, 4 additional shell companies, then one final destination. He frowned. "Blackstone Recovery Partners?" Laura folded her arms. "That company never existed." Another wave of whispers spread across the ballroom. Daniel stepped closer. "I remember Blackstone." Laura looked at him. "You remember the invoices." Daniel's face slowly changed as another realization surfaced. There was never an office. No employees. No patients. Laura looked directly at the investigators. Just one bank account. The lead investigator quietly closed the binder. "Who controlled it?" Laura answered without hesitation. "Richard Whitfield." My mother stumbled backward until she found the nearest chair. She lowered herself into it mechanically, staring at Richard as though she no longer recognized the man she had defended for years. "Richard," she whispered. "Is that true?" Richard didn't even acknowledge her. His attention remained fixed on Laura. "You've built an impressive story." Laura laughed softly. "It's not my story." She tapped the blue binder. "It's yours." Grant suddenly stepped between them. His voice shook. "Dad, tell me she made this up." Richard remained silent. "Tell me," Grant shouted. Every guest in the ballroom turned toward him. My brother's carefully polished confidence had completely disappeared. He no longer looked like the celebrated executive introduced less than an hour earlier. He looked like a frightened little boy desperate for someone to tell him his father wasn't a criminal. Richard finally answered. Some decisions were made to protect the company. Grant stared at him. That's not an answer. It's the only one you're getting. Grant slowly shook his head. You used me. Richard's eyes narrowed. Don't be dramatic. You signed my name. Richard didn't respond. Grant's breathing became heavier. Didn't you? Silence. Grant looked toward Laura. Did he? Laura nodded once. Many times. Grant's face turned completely white. Without telling me? Most of the executive authorizations attributed to you were completed after you had already left the office. Grant stumbled backward as though someone had punched him. Everything he believed about his own career was collapsing in front of hundreds of witnesses. Promotions, contracts, board appointments, financial approvals. He suddenly had no idea which achievements belonged to him and which had been manufactured by Richard. I watched him carefully. For the first time in his life, Grant wasn't looking for someone to rescue him. He was trying to figure out who he actually was. The older investigator reopened the binder and carefully removed a sealed envelope hidden inside one of the folders. It was noticeably older than everything else, yellowed around the edges, sealed with a faded legal sticker. Laura, he said slowly, what's this? Laura's expression became unexpectedly serious. I was hoping you'd ask. The investigator broke the seal carefully and unfolded several pages. His eyes moved across the document once, then twice. Suddenly, he stopped reading altogether. The younger investigator noticed immediately. What is it? The older investigator didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly lifted his eyes toward me. There was genuine surprise in his expression. Miss Whitfield, he said carefully, have you ever heard of the Bell Family Medical Trust? I frowned. No. Laura nodded. Of course you haven't. My heartbeat quickened. Why not? Laura took a slow breath before answering. Because Richard spent 12 years making sure you never found out it existed. The ballroom fell silent once more. My grandmother's maiden name had been Bell. I felt my pulse begin to race. What is the Bell Family Medical Trust? I asked. Laura looked directly into my eyes. It's the real reason your grandmother left you that riverfront house. Every instinct in my body told me the answer was about to change everything I believed I knew about my grandmother. Laura stepped toward me slowly. Mara, she said quietly, that house was never the inheritance. She paused just long enough for every person in the ballroom to lean forward. It was the key. The word hung in the air like a bell that refused to stop ringing. The key. Nobody spoke. Hundreds of guests stood frozen beneath the crystal chandeliers, completely forgetting they were attending a charity gala. Every eye remained fixed on Laura Bennett. Even Richard Whitfield, who had spent the last hour calculating his next move, looked unsettled. It wasn't anger that crossed his face this time. It was recognition. He knew exactly what Laura was about to reveal. Explain, I said quietly. Laura nodded once before turning toward the investigators. May I? The lead investigator gestured toward the stage. Please. Laura stepped into the spotlight that Grant had occupied less than an hour earlier. She rested one hand on the podium and slowly scanned the room before looking back at me. Your grandmother, Lillian Bell, never intended for the riverfront house to become your inheritance. She intended it to become your introduction. My pulse quickened. Introduction to what? Laura looked down at the yellow document inside the binder. To the Bell Family Medical Trust. She carefully unfolded another page and placed it beneath the ballroom lights. 78 years ago, your great-grandfather, Dr. Thomas Bell, established a charitable medical trust after returning from World War II. He believed no family should lose a loved one simply because they couldn't afford treatment. Several older donors exchanged surprised looks. One elderly physician whispered, I've heard stories about the Bell Trust. Laura nodded. Most people have. Almost nobody knows what happened to it. The younger investigator leaned closer. Go on. Laura pointed toward a faded organizational chart. The trust originally owned dozens of properties throughout Charleston. Small clinics, community pharmacies, rehabilitation centers, rental buildings that generated income for free medical care. The ballroom became silent again. "How much was it worth?" someone asked from the audience. Laura answered without hesitation. "Adjusted for today's market." She paused. "Approximately $460 million." Audible gasps erupted throughout the room. My mind went completely blank. $460 million. My grandmother had lived in a modest house, drove an aging sedan, wore clothes until they faded, and quietly paid strangers' medical bills without ever mentioning where the money came from. None of it made sense. "No," I whispered. "She would have told me." Laura's eyes softened. "She wanted to." My throat tightened. "Then why didn't she?" Laura slowly turned toward Richard. Because by the time Lillian realized what Richard was doing, she stopped for only a second. He already controlled the trust. My mother shot to her feet. "That's impossible." Laura looked directly at her. "Is it?" Richard finally laughed again, though it sounded more exhausted than confident. "You're building fairy tales now." Laura ignored him completely. She continued speaking directly to me. "After your grandfather died, your grandmother became sole trustee. She trusted Richard because he had experience managing healthcare organizations. She appointed him as financial administrator while keeping legal ownership herself. I felt my stomach sink. She trusted him." Laura nodded. "He spent years earning that trust." Daniel quietly added, "Then he started moving assets." The investigators exchanged another glance. Laura continued. "Not all at once. Never enough to trigger attention. One clinic, then another. Properties transferred into holding companies. Rental income redirected. Maintenance budgets inflated. Charitable grants reduced." She looked toward the blue binder. By the time Lillian realized what had happened, most of the trust had already disappeared. I finished. Laura looked at me sadly. "Yes." I struggled to process everything. "Why didn't she report him?" Richard answered before Laura could. "Because she couldn't." Every head turned toward him. Richard slowly straightened his jacket. Despite everything happening around him, his voice remained strangely calm. Lillian Bell made one fatal mistake. Nobody interrupted. Richard looked directly at me. "She trusted family more than paperwork." Laura's eyes narrowed. "Don't." Richard continued anyway. When she confronted me, she discovered she had signed dozens of restructuring authorizations over the years without reading them carefully. My mother's face lost what little color remained. "Richard." He ignored her. "She believed they were ordinary financial documents." Laura shook her head. "You lied to her." Richard shrugged slightly. "Business is complicated." I felt anger rising inside me, unlike anything I had experienced before. "You tricked my grandmother." Richard finally met my eyes. "I educated her." Before I could respond, Samuel Ortiz stepped forward again. "That's not true." Everyone looked toward him. Samuel reached into his leather folder one final time and removed a small cassette tape enclosed inside a protective plastic case. The object looked almost out of place in a room filled with smartphones and digital cameras. She knew. Samuel held the cassette carefully. Near the end, Laura's eyes widened. "You still have it?" Samuel nodded. "She asked me to keep it safe." The lead investigator accepted the cassette carefully. "What's on this?" Samuel looked at me. "Your grandmother's voice." My heart nearly stopped. Samuel swallowed hard before continuing. 3 weeks before she died, she asked me to help her record a message. The ballroom became absolutely silent. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Richard's confidence faltered for the briefest moment. Samuel looked directly at the investigator. She said if anything happened to her before she could fix what Richard had done. He paused, gripping the cassette more tightly. Someone needed to make sure Mara heard the truth. My eyes filled with tears for the first time that night. Not because of the trust, not because of the money, because somewhere during the final weeks of her life, my grandmother had realized she was running out of time, and instead of recording instructions for lawyers, she recorded a message for me. The investigator carefully turned the cassette over in his hand. A faded handwritten label remained attached to the front. In delicate blue ink, barely visible after so many years, were 6 simple words. For Mara, when she is ready. The investigator looked toward the ballroom's audiovisual technician. Do you have a cassette player? The technician blinked in surprise. Actually, he hesitated. Our archive room still has one. Every person in the ballroom held their breath, because within the next few minutes, the voice of a woman who had been dead for 3 years was about to speak. No one left the ballroom. No one reached for another drink. The gala had transformed into something far beyond a charity event. It had become the place where decades of carefully buried truth were clawing their way into the light. The audiovisual technician hurried through a side hallway and returned several minutes later carrying a dusty cassette player that looked as though it belonged in a museum. He placed it gently on the podium while everyone watched in complete silence. The lead investigator carefully removed the cassette from its plastic case, inspecting it for damage before sliding it into the machine. A soft mechanical click echoed through the ballroom. For one brief moment, nothing happened except the faint sound of the tape beginning to turn. Then static filled the speakers. Several guests instinctively held their breath. The recording was old, fragile, imperfect. After a few seconds, a woman's voice emerged through the crackling audio. It was weak but unmistakably warm. If you're hearing this. Another burst of static interrupted her. And then I'm no longer here. My knees nearly gave out beneath me. I hadn't heard my grandmother's voice in 3 years. Every memory I had fought to keep alive suddenly returned all at once. Sunday mornings baking bread together, long afternoons tending the lemon trees behind her little house, the quiet way she always squeezed my hand whenever life became too heavy. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the sound of her voice settle into my heart. Around the ballroom, several people lowered their heads respectfully. Even the reporters stopped recording notes and simply listened. My grandmother continued. Hello, sweetheart. Tears filled my eyes immediately. She always called me sweetheart, never Mara, never my full name, just sweetheart. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you everything while I was alive. Her breathing sounded labored between sentences. I wanted to, more than you'll ever know. The ballroom remained perfectly still. If you found this recording, she continued softly, then Richard finally made his move. Every eye shifted toward Richard. He stared at the cassette player without expression, though I noticed his hands slowly tightening into fists. My grandmother's voice remained calm. You may wonder why I trusted him. She paused to catch her breath. I ask myself that every day. Another wave of static crackled across the speakers before her voice returned. People rarely steal from strangers. They steal from those who love them. Several guests quietly wiped tears from their eyes. Even people who had never met my grandmother could hear the heartbreak in her voice. Richard wasn't always the man you've met, she coughed softly before continuing. When he first joined our family, he worked harder than anyone I'd ever seen. He cared for patients. He stayed late at the clinics. He convinced me he believed in your grandfather's dream. Laura slowly lowered her head. Daniel closed his eyes. They had both lived through that transformation. The changes happened slowly, my grandmother whispered. At first, it was little things, numbers that didn't quite match, meetings I wasn't invited to, properties being transferred for tax reasons. She sighed deeply. Every explanation sounded reasonable, until one day, nothing belonged to the trust anymore. The investigator quietly adjusted the volume as her voice weakened. I confronted Richard. The room seemed to shrink around those words. He told me I was confused. He said my memory wasn't what it used to be. My mother covered her mouth. Richard remained motionless. For a little while, my grandmother admitted. I believed him. I felt my chest tighten. She had doubted herself because someone she trusted convinced her she was losing her mind. Then Samuel brought me copies of the maintenance logs. Samuel lowered his eyes. And Laura secretly mailed me financial reports Richard thought had been destroyed. Laura's eyes filled with tears. Together, my grandmother continued, they gave me back the truth. I looked toward both of them, with gratitude I couldn't put into words. They hadn't simply preserved documents. They had protected my grandmother's dignity. The recording continued. Sweetheart. Her voice became even softer. If you're listening, I need you to understand something. I stepped closer to the podium without realizing it. The trust was never about money. Silence filled the ballroom again. Money disappears. Another pause. Buildings collapse. A longer pause. Companies fail. Her breathing became slower. But kindness. She smiled gently, and somehow everyone in the room could hear it. Kindness is the only investment that keeps growing after we're gone. Tears streamed down my face freely now. That's why I chose you. The words hit me harder than everything else combined. Not because of wealth, not because of inheritance, because she had chosen me. You were never the strongest. I smiled through tears. That sounded exactly like her. You were never the loudest. Another faint laugh escaped the old recording. And Lord knows you were never the family's favorite. Soft laughter spread through the ballroom mixed with tears. Even in her final message, she knew how to make people smile. I chose you because every time life gave you the chance to become bitter. She paused. You chose compassion instead. My breathing became unsteady. Never let anyone convince you that kindness is weakness. Those words settled over the room like a blessing. Richard believes power comes from controlling people. Another pause. He's wrong. The tape crackled loudly for a moment before her voice returned one final time. Real power comes from giving people hope when they have none. She inhaled slowly. Inside the old greenhouse behind the river house. My heart skipped. There's a stone bench your grandfather built the summer before your mother graduated high school. I remembered it immediately. Weathered limestone surrounded by climbing roses. Under the center stone, she whispered, you'll find the final trust documents Richard never found. Gasps echoed throughout the ballroom. Richard's head snapped upward. For the first time all evening, pure panic replaced calculation. My grandmother continued, her voice barely audible now. Those papers prove who the lawful trustee has always been. My pulse raced. The ballroom stood frozen. Sweetheart, she whispered one last time. Go home. A long pause followed. It's time to unlock the door. The tape clicked softly as it reached the end. Absolute silence filled the ballroom. No one moved. No one spoke. Then everyone heard it. Richard Whitfield laughed. Not confidently. Not politely. It was the hollow laugh of a man who suddenly realized the one secret he had spent 12 years protecting had just been revealed by someone he believed he had already defeated. Without warning, he turned and sprinted toward the ballroom exit. But he was already too late. Because every person in the room now knew exactly where the final evidence was hidden. The moment Richard Whitfield bolted toward the ballroom doors, instinct took over. 2 state officers moved immediately, but Richard wasn't running toward freedom. He was running toward time. He knew exactly what my grandmother's recording meant. Somewhere beneath that old stone bench behind the river house lay the only documents he had failed to destroy, and if he reached them first, 12 years of carefully hidden deception might disappear forever. Stop him! The lead investigator shouted. Richard shoved through a cluster of stunned guests, knocking over a champagne table that crashed across the marble floor. Glass shattered in every direction. Several reporters jumped aside while photographers continued firing their cameras without stopping. One officer caught Richard's jacket for only a second before the fabric slipped from his grasp. Richard burst through the ballroom entrance and disappeared into the hotel corridor. Grant stared after him in disbelief. He's really running, he whispered. He knows where the documents are. The younger investigator immediately spoke into his radio. Suspect leaving East Corridor. Notify every unit. Dispatch officers to James Island. Secure the Bell property immediately. My heart began pounding. James Island. My grandmother's home. The greenhouse. The stone bench. Richard had almost a 30-minute head start if he reached his car before the police established a perimeter. I stepped toward the investigators. I know the fastest route. The lead investigator looked directly at me. Can you get us there? Yes. Then you're coming with us. My mother suddenly reached for my arm. Mara, don't. I turned toward her. She looked exhausted. The confident social leader who had walked into the gala that evening no longer existed. In her place stood a woman watching everything she believed about her life collapse around her. Please, she whispered. Don't let this become even worse. I looked at her sadly. Mom, it already is. She lowered her eyes. I never knew. I wanted to believe her. A part of even word truly did. But another part remembered too many birthdays forgotten, too many achievements ignored, too many conversations where she chose comfort over truth. Maybe you didn't know everything, I answered quietly, but you knew enough to stop asking questions. Tears rolled silently down her face. Before either of us could say anything else, Grant stepped forward. He looked as though he had aged 10 years in a single evening. I'm coming too. The investigator frowned. Mr. Whitfield, given the circumstances. Grant interrupted him. I know. He swallowed hard. I'm probably part of this investigation. He looked toward me. But if there's even a chance those documents prove what Laura said, I need to see them myself. For several seconds, I simply stared at him. This was the first honest sentence I had ever heard my brother speak without trying to impress someone. The investigator finally nodded. You ride with us. You're not to leave our sight. Within minutes, the ballroom emptied into organized chaos. Police vehicles surrounded the hotel, while additional units raced toward James Island, with lights flashing through the Charleston streets. Reporters attempted to follow, but officers quickly established a security perimeter. Laura, Daniel, and Samuel remained behind to continue giving formal statements. I climbed into the back seat of an unmarked SUV beside the lead investigator while Grant sat across from me in complete silence. As the vehicle accelerated into the night, Charleston's historic streets blurred past the windows. Nobody spoke for several minutes. Finally, Grant broke the silence. Did Grandma ever tell you about the greenhouse? I nodded. She loved that place. I barely remember it. I looked out the window. That's because you never visited unless Mom made you. He lowered his head. You're right. Another long silence followed. Then, almost too quietly to hear, he said, I'm sorry. I turned toward him. For what? He laughed bitterly. Pick one. Neither of us smiled. I spent my entire life believing I deserved everything I had. His voice cracked. I never asked who paid the price. Those words stayed with me as the SUV crossed the bridge toward James Island. For years, I had imagined confronting Grant with every painful memory I carried, every stolen opportunity, every dismissal, every sacrifice. Yet hearing him finally admit the truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like mourning the relationship we might have had if someone had taught us honesty instead of competition. The radio suddenly crackled. Unit 3 to command. The driver's hand immediately reached for the microphone. Go ahead. We've located Richard Whitfield's vehicle. The investigator leaned forward. Where? Bell Residence. My heart stopped. Status? Vehicle is empty. Every person inside the SUV went silent. Repeat, the investigator said. The vehicle is abandoned in the driveway. The SUV accelerated even faster. Less than 4 minutes later, we turned onto the narrow road leading toward my grandmother's house. Red and blue emergency lights reflected across the ancient oak trees lining the property. Richard's black sedan sat crookedly beside the front porch with the driver's door hanging open. Officers were already searching the grounds with flashlights. I jumped out before the SUV had fully stopped. The familiar scent of salt air and lemon trees hit me immediately. For one heartbreaking second, I almost expected my grandmother to open the front door with flour on her apron, asking why everyone had arrived so late. Instead, the house stood dark and silent. An officer ran toward us. We've cleared the residence. Any sign of Whitfield? The investigator asked. The officer shook his head. Nothing inside. I looked past them toward the old greenhouse at the far end of the property. Its glass walls reflected the flashing police lights. The door stood slightly open. My stomach tightened. The greenhouse, I whispered. We all started running. Gravel crunched beneath our feet as we crossed the garden. The closer we came, the stronger the smell of freshly turned earth became. The investigator reached the greenhouse first and pushed the door fully open. Flashlights swept across rows of abandoned flower beds, rusted gardening tools, and the familiar stone bench standing exactly where I remembered it. But something was wrong. The ground beneath the bench had already been disturbed. Fresh dirt covered the floor. Broken pieces of limestone lay scattered across the greenhouse. Someone had dug beneath the center stone. The lead investigator slowly lowered his flashlight toward the empty cavity beneath the bench. There was nothing inside. Absolutely nothing. Grant stared into the hole without speaking. I felt my chest tighten as every terrible possibility rushed through my mind. Richard had been here first. Then one of the officers called from the far corner of the greenhouse. "Sir, you need to see this." We hurried over together. Resting on an old wooden potting table was a single sealed envelope. My name was written across the front, in my grandmother's unmistakable handwriting, and beneath it, in fresh black ink that definitely wasn't hers, someone had added 6 chilling words. "You're already too late, Mara." For several endless seconds, nobody reached for the envelope. The greenhouse was silent except for the distant sound of police radios outside and the steady rhythm of my own heartbeat. My name, written in my grandmother's graceful handwriting, seemed to pull me forward while the sentence beneath it tried to force me back. "You're already too late, Mara." The lead investigator carefully examined the envelope without touching the writing. "Fresh ink," he said quietly. "Whoever wrote this did it recently." I looked around the greenhouse. The broken stone, the overturned flower pots, the disturbed soil beneath the bench. Richard had definitely been here. But something didn't fit. If he had found what he came for, why leave the envelope behind? I picked it up carefully. The paper felt heavier than it should have. "Open it," Samuel said softly as he stepped into the greenhouse doorway. None of us had noticed him arrive. Laura and Daniel followed close behind, both breathing hard after hurrying across the property. I slowly broke the seal. Inside was a single folded letter and a small brass. My hands trembled as I unfolded the letter. It was unmistakably my grandmother's handwriting. "My dearest sweetheart," it began. "If you're reading this, then Richard found the bench exactly as I expected he would." I stopped breathing. "He expected him," Grant whispered. I continued reading aloud. "Richard has always believed that the most valuable thing is the thing everyone can see. That's why I knew he would dig beneath the stone. I wanted him to." Every person inside the greenhouse looked at one another in confusion. The letter continued. "The bench was never hiding the truth. It was hiding a distraction. Richard had been tricked. My grandmother had anticipated his every move years before it happened." Tears blurred my vision as I kept reading. "Real trust is never built on hiding treasure. It's built on choosing the right person to carry responsibility." I looked down at the small brass key resting in my palm. My grandmother had written another sentence beneath it. "This key opens the old safety deposit box at First Carolina Savings, Box 214. Laura's eyes widened instantly. "I remember that bank." The lead investigator looked at me. "Did anyone ever mention a safety deposit box?" I slowly shook my head. "Never." My grandmother's letter continued. "Inside that box are the original trust documents, every signed amendment, every property deed, every personal journal, and every letter I wrote after discovering Richard's betrayal. Those papers were never in the greenhouse. Richard had spent 12 years searching for something that had never been there. My grandmother had allowed him to believe he had outsmarted her while quietly protecting the truth somewhere else entirely." Daniel let out a slow breath. "She played the long game." Samuel smiled sadly. "That's Lillian." The investigators immediately contacted the district judge to obtain an emergency order securing the bank before anyone else could reach it. Less than an hour later, just before sunrise, we stood inside the vault of First Carolina Savings. The branch manager unlocked Box 214 under police supervision and carefully placed its contents on a large conference table. No one spoke. Inside were neatly organized legal binders, original trust certificates, handwritten journals, photographs dating back nearly 50 years, notarized property records, and one final envelope marked simply, "Read last." The lead investigator spent several minutes reviewing the legal documents before slowly removing his glasses. "These are authentic." Laura closed her eyes in relief. Daniel quietly sat down, overwhelmed. The investigator looked directly at me. "Miss Whitfield." He smiled for the first time all night. According to these documents, your grandmother never transferred ownership of the Bell Family Medical Trust. My heart pounded. He continued. Richard was only appointed financial administrator with limited authority. He turned another page. 3 years before her death, Lillian legally revoked every one of Richard's administrative powers. Grant stared at the paperwork in disbelief. Then everything he signed after that. The investigator nodded. Appears to have been unauthorized. My mother lowered her head and began crying quietly. Not dramatic tears. Not public tears. The quiet tears of someone finally forced to confront years of willful blindness. I opened the final envelope my grandmother had labeled, "Read last." Inside was one handwritten page. "Sweetheart," it began. "If you've made it this far, then you already know the truth. You may also be wondering what to do with everything I've left behind." I smiled through tears. It was exactly the question I had been asking myself. The answer is simple. I kept reading. "Do not spend your life trying to punish Richard. Justice belongs to the courts. Your life belongs to you." The room became completely still. "Build the place we dreamed about. Open every door we wished had existed for people who had nowhere else to go. Let this family be remembered not for the money someone tried to steal, but for the lives you choose to save." I couldn't hold back my tears any longer. Every painful moment of the past several hours suddenly felt smaller than the future she was asking me to build. 3 months later, Richard Whitfield was formally indicted on multiple counts of healthcare fraud, wire fraud, forgery, obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy. Daniel Reeves and Laura Bennett testified during the investigation, while Samuel Ortiz's records became some of the strongest supporting evidence presented to the grand jury. Harbor Grace Foundation removed every executive connected to the fraud and publicly apologized for its role in allowing the deception to continue for so many years. Grant accepted responsibility for the documents he had signed without understanding and agreed to cooperate fully with investigators. He wasn't declared innocent, but neither was he the architect of the scheme. For the first time in his life, he stopped hiding behind someone else's shadow and started earning forgiveness one honest decision at a time. My mother sold the mansion she had once been so proud of and quietly volunteered at community clinics every weekend. She never asked me to forgive her. She simply showed up where people needed help. Sometimes actions speak more honestly than apologies. 1 year later, standing beneath the restored greenhouse beside my grandmother's riverfront home, I watched the first patients arrive at the Bell Recovery House. The old stone bench remained exactly where it had always been, not because it hid a secret, but because it reminded me that the strongest foundations are built on truth instead of fear. Above the front entrance, a small bronze plaque carried my grandmother's favorite sentence: "Kindness is the only investment that keeps growing after we're gone." Every person who walked through those doors read those words before receiving care. Every family who found hope inside those walls became part of her legacy. Richard had spent 12 years believing the greatest inheritance was hidden inside a fortune. My grandmother knew better. The greatest inheritance had never been money, property, or power. It was the courage to choose compassion after surviving betrayal. And that was the one thing no one could ever steal.